Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's lecture on weather, climate, and the American Civil War. My name's Paul Quigley. I'm director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, which is based in the History Department at Virginia Tech and which is sponsoring tonight's event. Throughout the year, we offer many different kinds of educational opportunities in Civil War era history for various audiences. We work a lot with VT students. We work a lot with K through 12 teachers and their students, and also, like with tonight's event, with members of the general public as well. And there's really one reason why we're able to offer most of these programs for free, and that's because of the generosity of the center's donors who agree with us that now more than ever, a deeper understanding of Civil War era history is really, really vital. So I want to thank our donors for making this possible. And I also want to extend the invitation to you all to join the ranks of our donors as well. Tonight or today happens to be Giving Day here at Virginia Tech. And so it's a great opportunity to support the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies and support everything we're doing with Civil War era history education. I want to emphasize we're not asking for $1 million, although if you have $1 million, we can work with you. But really, even just a few dollars donation can help make sure that we can continue to put on events like this, continue to do our various kinds of educational outreach and support Virginia Tech students as well. So I'm going to paste a link in the chat here, which you can follow if you're interested in supporting us. And we really appreciate everyone who is able to do that tonight. I also encourage you to check out our website, civilwar.vt.edu, or of course you can find us on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. And tonight's talk, by the way, will be posted on YouTube hopefully later this week. So if you want to share it with anyone else who you think would appreciate it, you'll have that opportunity through our YouTube channel. Tonight, I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kenneth W. who retired just a couple of years ago from his position as the Drowan Professor of Southern History at Auburn University. Dr. No is the author or editor of 8 books, most recently The Howling Storm, Weather, Climate, and the American Civil War. And of course, that one is going to be the subject of our conversation tonight. You're going to find out much more about this book and this topic. This was a Lincoln Prize finalist and also a co-winner of the Ulbrich Memorial Book Award. So Dr. No has actually won multiple awards for his teaching and his research as well. He's twice been under consideration for the Pulitzer Prize. But the highlight of his career, he's going to love this, in my opinion, is when he got his master's degree right here in the history department at Virginia Tech. So we're really pleased to have him back virtually in Blacksburg tonight. And he's going to speak to us for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for discussion and conversation with the audience. And the way that's going to work is we're going to invite you to type in your questions, so you won't be able to use your microphones or turn on your cameras or anything, but you will be able to use that Q&A box in Zoom to type in a question at any time, and then we'll get to as many of those as we can after the talk. And we'll wrap things up right around 8:15 p.m. Eastern time. So just over an hour from now, we will wrap things up. That's all from me for now. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. Let's give Dr. No a warm welcome to our screens. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Rachel Stanley. Thanks to all of you for joining me this evening. And yes, I'm a very proud holder of a master's degree from Virginia Tech, wearing my colors tonight, as I have been tempted to do since a certain basketball game the other night, which I know we're still celebrating in my own. I'm going to go to share screen and pull up a PowerPoint that I'll be using for the next few minutes. I'm looking forward to your questions at the end of this. So, the Howling Storm, Weather, Climate, and the American Civil War. This is a talk based on a very big book. It took me about 12 years to write, but it actually has a very simple premise. And that's that if we want to fully understand the Civil War, we need to ground it in the environment. We need to think about how weather, topography, all sorts of other natural factors affected the war. This title itself comes from a quotation that I ran across fairly early in my research, although it was very late in the process that it became the title. Henry Kyd Douglas, as many of you know, was an aide to Stonewall Jackson during the first part of the American Civil War. He later wrote a book called I Rode with Stonewall, or as historians such as Gary Gallagher like to call it, Stonewall Rode with Me. Kyd Douglas liked to talk about himself a lot. But I think this is an incredible passage that sums up really what I hope you take away tonight from this talk. July 1st, 1862, the night of the Battle of Malvern Hill, the last of the 7 days battles. The entire Peninsula Campaign had taken place in a moment down on the peninsula when it essentially rained every other day, creating all sorts of mud, all sorts of chaos. The heavy rains stopped more or less for the 7 days, although there were thunderstorms most days. But then the night of Malvern Hill, the night of July 1st, the heavens opened up, and there was this amazing, apparently incredible storm that lasted well into the next day. And it was in this storm that the Federal Army retreated down the James River from Malvern Hill down to Harrison's Landing, leaving the Confederates in charge of the field, although the Confederates had actually lost the Battle of Malvern. It was a terrible night. Kyd Douglas, writing about that experience, said this: howling of the storm, cry of the wounded, the groans of the dying, the glare of the torch upon the faces of the dead or into the shining eyes of the speechless wounded, looking up in hopes of relief, the ground slippery with a mixture of mud and blood, all in the dark, hopeless, starless night. Surely it was a gruesome picture of war at its most horrid shape. I want to suggest to you tonight that since 1865, since we've been writing about this war, we have had a tendency to write more about the blood than the mud. We write about the battles, we write about campaigns, we write about individuals, but sometimes we forget the natural environment in which the war took place. We make that distinction. What I have learned in working on this project is that soldiers at the time did not make that distinction. Whether it was as much a part of the horror of Civil War service as was combat. And I think Kyd Douglas points out to us that we need to think about the mud and the blood. We need to integrate these various aspects of the war into a whole that will be closer to the truth. What do I mean by this? Here's some basic ideas that I think will help you understand where I'm going in this talk, and I hope you keep them in mind as you look at the Civil War in the days and weeks and months and years to come. Some basic ideas. Point one, the Civil War was fought outside. Now, I have to tell you, the first time I ever gave a talk on this topic was in Athens, Georgia. And I was trying to, ingratiate myself with the crowd, I suppose. I thought I would start out telling a joke, and everyone would laugh, and we would go from there. So this was my attempt at a joke. The Civil War was fought outside. No one laughed. No one said anything. They all just sort of looked at me. And I realized at that moment, and certainly in discussions after my talk, that this was actually a serious point that I really had made by accident. Civil War was fought outside. It was not fought indoors. It was not fought in an office. It was not fought in a classroom. It was not fought in Castle Coliseum. It was not fought in a place with climate control, a level playing ground. It was fought outside in the heat and the cold, the mud, the dust, the rain, the snow. But somehow we had minimized that. I won't say that we'd forgotten, but I think we had minimized. What do I mean? Think, for example, about George McClellan on the peninsula. How easy it is for many of us, how easy it was for me for many years in classroom, to give McClellan a hard time. Why couldn't he move his army 20 miles a day up the peninsula? Why did it take him so long, even once he got past the flooded Warwick River at Yorktown? What took so long? What took so long is that the Peninsula Campaign and every other Civil War campaign did not take place in a climate-controlled arena. It took place outside with real mud and real rain. And I think we have a tendency to forget that. We sit around as armchair generals and we think to ourselves, well, I could have moved the army 20 miles. And it's not just our generation. Abraham Lincoln did that. I argue at one point in the book that Lincoln was the first armchair general sitting in his office in the White House, wondering why these generals couldn't do what surely was possible. And the generals are writing back saying to him, it's not possible here on the ground. The Civil War was fought outside. Point two, weather has agency. This is a concept I learned pretty early in this process, working with environmental historians. Environmental historians will argue as one of their basic tenets that weather has agency. Weather is an active factor. By that, I do not mean that weather had an agenda, that weather had a brain, weather had a plan, weather was thinking about, oh, gee, which side do I want to win this war? Weather wasn't thinking, but weather was acting. Weather was an active participant in this war. Think about watching a stage play and imagine a painted background of a storm or a sunny day. That's how we've regarded weather. I would prefer that you think about weather as one of the actors on the stage, participating, shaping events. I'm old enough now to remember when we pretty routinely talked about the Civil War as a contest between the blue and the gray, or the North and the South. That's what I learned in the 1960s growing up in Montgomery County, Virginia, not far from Blacksburg. But in fact, I think it's very helpful to think of this conflict as taking place between the blue, the gray, and the weather. The weather as a non-aligned power. The weather switching sides. Largely, as it turns out, supporting the federal cause, supporting the United States government, not the Confederacy. But nonetheless, completely capable of betraying the men in blue for a few weeks or months and supporting the other army. Think of the weather as an active player, an actor on the stage, not a painted background. Point three, no one could predict the weather in 1861. No one. There were people who tried. Occasionally they would show up in the White House and try to convince President Lincoln that they could predict the weather. And after a week or two, he would throw them out because they had failed. No one could do that. People in the 19th century did not even have basic notions that we see on TV nightly, like warm fronts and cold fronts. That's a 20th century development. But that doesn't mean that people weren't trying to understand how weather worked. And that was important for me. In 1848, the Smithsonian Institution started a national project of having people around the country compile weather data. 7 a.m., 2 p.m., 9 p.m. every day. They would even send you the instruments if you agreed to do this. Most of these weather observers were professors or ministers, but there are really some interesting people who pop up along the way. The weather observer in Natchez, Mississippi, for example, was a former slave who'd become a free man. They compiled an incredible amount of data, sending forms to Washington every month. The system largely broke down in the South during the Civil War, although not completely. Some of these folks kept sending their data. And what we end up with is this mass of information that in the Civil War community, we by and large have not used, with the notable exception of Bob Crick, who used some of this data, notably data from Washington and a couple other observers in Virginia, for his book, Civil War Weather in Virginia. But by and large, we've ignored this data, and it's out there for much of the country. It's not as extensive in the Confederacy as we would want by any means, but it's there. And it can tell us so much more about Civil War weather than. Point 4. Civil War weather was not normal. Now, I will qualify that by saying that weather generally is never normal. Weather certainly varies from year to year, month to month, day to day, place to place. I could leave my house in Elliston, Virginia. It would be gray, maybe a little rainy. I could head up toward Blacksburg, and by the time I got to the top of Christiansburg Mountain, there was snow on it. So weather varies from place to place. It varies in time. But that said, there are ideas about what is more or less normal weather for any area. That's what we call climate. Climate is the combination of all of those weather readings, day after day, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. So we sort of know what's normal. And what we find in the Civil War is that people who were living through it were convinced that the weather was not normal. The times were strange, even the weather was strange. And I can't begin to tell you how often I ran across this in my research. People writing letters to soldiers at the front, December 1861, the daffodils are coming up. I've never seen this happen. Flowers are blooming in December. What is happening? Soldiers constantly recording conversations they had with elderly people, usually somehow called the oldest inhabitants of the region. And even they would point out that this was strange. Weather's not normally like this around here. We really don't know what's happening. So when I say that Civil War weather was not normal, that's not me expressing my opinion. That's me reporting what so many people in the first half of the 1860s were writing and saying. They knew something was happening that was unusual. So what was happening? Given the parameters of 30 minutes or so, I can't go into a lot of detail, but let me just point out 3 things to you. First of all, there had been a massive drought in the western half of the United States, in some ways going back to the 1840s, but certainly intensifying around 1856 and lasting through the Civil War. Geographers and meteorologists refer to this as the Great Civil War Drought. This amazed me when I first heard about it. I'm a Civil War historian, and I've never heard of the Great Civil War Drought. I don't think any of the rest of us had either. This did affect the American Civil War to an extent. Think about Texas. Think about the Indian Territory, where some indigenous nations decided to support the Confederacy because there was a drought. They were starving. They needed food, and Washington wasn't delivering. Maybe they would do better with Richmond. Certainly in Sibley's campaign into New Mexico. So you've got this massive drought that's taking place in the western half of what is now the United States. Secondly, you've got the operation of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO. You're probably familiar with this because you watch the TV weather at night. And you know that your local meteorologist on TV has probably mentioned several times already that we are right now, February 2024, in an El Nino year. What makes an El Nino year? It's complicated, but essentially it has to do with ocean currents, temperature of the ocean, the jet streams moving north and south. But certainly the ENSO affects weather in the United States. 1861 was, by most accounts, there seems to be wide agreement on this, a La Nina year. La Nina, sometimes called an extreme normal year. And a La Nina year for the Civil War would have brought really hot and dry summers and cold winters in the Northeast. Hot and dry summers, think about First Battle of Manassas. Even more so, think about the Battle of Wilson's Creek out in Missouri, which was affected by very high temperatures over 100 degrees and a lack of water. Now, there is some disagreement among those who study this. We don't have satellite data from the 19th century. We can't go back and see exactly what was happening. The data just doesn't exist, but the data that is available to us suggests that 1862 and 1864 were El Nino years, just like 2024. And what that would have meant, cold and rainy winters and springs in the American South, or I can say that differently, cold and rainy winters and springs in the Confederacy. Our local meteorologists on TV always talk about El Nino or La Nina, but they rarely talk about another factor which influences the East Coast in some ways just as much, and that's the North Atlantic Oscillation. There is a permanent low pressure system around Iceland. There is a permanent high pressure system around the Azores out in the Atlantic, but the differences in barometric pressure between those two systems can become greater or lesser. When they become lesser, when they become closer together, that's called a negative North Atlantic Oscillation. 1862, 1864, and 1865 were negative years for the North Atlantic Oscillation, which would mean, again, colder than usual winters in the South, more snow, also very cold weather in Western Europe. 1944 was a negative North Atlantic Oscillation year. Think about the Battle of the Bulge. And what's happening in the American Civil War is that you've got the North Atlantic Oscillation and the ENSO pattern happening at the same time. And what the result is very unusual weather for the American Civil War. We cannot just assume that weather in the war was like weather now. It wasn't. So what does this mean practically? There are some basic weathering patterns here, and you can find exceptions to all of these if you look in the right place. But by and large, here is what was happening during the American Civil War. Summer, fall of 1861, a La Nina year, was hotter than usual, extremely hot in some places. I mentioned Wilson's Creek, where unit cohesion literally fell apart in the Federal Army at one point as men were fighting each other for water. December 1861, it snowed early, and then it got unusually warm. So warm that by the end of the month, Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson thought it was a perfectly fine idea to move his army out of the valley toward Bath and Romney to seal off that potential approach from federal forces in West Virginia. And on the first day of the march to Bath, a lot of those Confederates just threw away their blankets, they threw away their coats. They were regretting it by nightfall as they were hit with some of the coldest and harshest weather of the American Civil War. As conditions change, as we enter into that El Nino year, and don't forget, El Nino is a Spanish term for the Christ child, so-called because they usually begin, these patterns usually begin in December, around Christmas. January into the spring of 1862, in the Confederacy, colder than usual, wetter than usual. I've looked at records, diaries from farmers and planters You talk about getting their crops into the field weeks late because it's just too wet to plow, or else they go out and they plant and everything dies and they have to go back and replant a second time. So you have this first half of 1862, which is cold and wet, and it brings with it lots of flooding, like Fort Henry, like the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, like the flooding around the time of Shiloh, like the heavy rain on the peninsula, like the flooded Warwick River, like the flooded approaches to Richmond. And then this rain just stopped. In the summer and fall of 1862, we go from a very wet and cold period to drought. So if you got your crops into the field 3 or 4 weeks late, you're in more trouble now because it's not raining at all and they're dying in the field because there's not enough rain. I'm really familiar with this drought. This is what really got me interested in Civil War weather. This is the drought that shaped Bragg's Kentucky campaign, Perryville campaign. William Stark Rosecrans is still dealing with lower than normal rivers and less supply by water as late as the Battle of Murfreesboro at the end of the year. That's 1862. What happens in 1863? Same thing. Same pattern repeats itself. 1864, it happens again. It just shifts to the north. You still have these conditions in Missouri. You still have these conditions in Virginia. Virginia is hit with this 3 years in a row. But now for the first time, you have this unusual rain and especially these droughts spreading into the northern states. When I was a young man, I learned that, northern agriculture somehow boomed during the Civil War. They had reaping machines. They didn't miss all those boys. That's not true at all. The high point of northern agricultural production during the Civil War was 1862. There were a series of very strange frosts coming out of Canada that destroyed crops in the field in 1863. And then in 1864, you're dealing with this drought. The combination of too much rain in the spring, drought in summer and fall, had a dramatic effect on food supply, to an extent in the North, but especially in the Confederacy. Joan Cashin at Ohio State wrote several years ago that it's time for us to start rethinking the notion that there was famine in the Confederacy. Well, here's one of the basic reasons for that. I was struck by how in 1861 Southern ministers loved talking about how good the weather was. It was a sign that God favored the Confederacy. They quit talking about the weather in 1862 and never went back because weather seemed to be favoring the Union. Now that's on the home front. Battles and campaigns. There was a very naive period in my research when I thought I could actually quantify how battles and campaigns were affected by weather. And, some would be more than others. But I gave up on that because it occurred to me, probably too late, that every battle and campaign was affected by weather. We know this. Those of us who will study this battle or that battle, we know that, but sometimes we don't put those broader patterns together. As I've said in a recent talk, we don't connect the dots. We just look at the dot. So here's just some examples. Fort Henry, a flooded river that essentially allowed the Federal ironclad fleet to sail up next to the fort and shoot down into it. That's how bad the flooding was from that El Nino year. Chickamauga, the two armies that met at Chickamauga had been marching through hot, dry weather, but the night before the battle, it turned very, very cold. It turned very, very cold because there was an Arctic system spreading across the continent. The same system that destroyed basically half the crops here where I live now in Champaign County, Illinois, was also the system that hit Chickamauga and brought about cold conditions, which were horrific for wounded men in particular. The Mud March obviously is the most famous example of weather affecting a campaign. In the lower left-hand corner, Early's raid on Washington in 1864 fought in roughly 100-degree weather, dust clouds everywhere, clogging men's noses and lungs, slowing them down, stragglers falling out along the way. I'm not much of a what-if historian, but I think you can really argue that if the weather had been a little less hot, if the weather had been maybe in the 80s or 90s and there was occasional rain to keep the dust down, Early's force would have been to Washington a day or two earlier. They might have actually gotten into the city. And you can imagine the devastating political effect that would have had on the Lincoln administration. But, and here's where I really made a mistake, I think. We shouldn't just think about weather as bad, because good weather affects campaigns too. Growing up down in Elliston, growing up in Montgomery County, my grandfather, among other things, was a former sailor. And when he said it's fixing to weather, he meant something bad was about to happen. But we have to think about good weather too. Battle of Antietam. The weather was almost perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. It was a little musty in the morning. There'd been rain right before just to keep us down. You could not have created better conditions for killing people in mass numbers on the bloodiest single day of it. The weather was perfect for them. Down in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, Sherman's March to the Sea, which took place in perfect weather for Sherman, for the Federals. Not too hot, not too cold, just enough rain to keep the dust down as they were marching day after day. When Sherman got to Savannah at the end of 1864, he admitted in his communications back to Washington that things might have gone differently had the weather not favored him so much. So good weather, bad weather shapes campaigns, battles, in all sorts of ways. Let me sum up, and we can move on to your questions. Good and bad weather shaped battles and campaigns. Good and bad weather shaped the home front and disillusionment on the home front and people getting sick of the war on the home front. Certainly had an effect on food supply, which continued to dwindle in the Confederacy during the war. Weather's not the only reason for that, but it's a major reason that I think we forgot. In dealing with weather, federal armies were usually better equipped because of that industrial base that we always talk about at the beginning of our Civil War courses. Initially through private purchase and later through issue from the government, federal soldiers had rubber ponchos. They had more portable tents. They had, by and large, more access to new uniforms, new shoes. The Confederates either had to rely on substitutes that weren't as good. You can't produce rubber anywhere in the Confederacy. Or they just had to stop and get what they could from the Federal Army. You know, to the point that by 1863, 1864, Confederates are sleeping under federal tents. It used to be very chic to criticize those men in Jubal Early's force at Cedar Creek who have nearly won a battle, but then they stop and start plundering the Union camps. You know how horrible that was. I mean, these guys looking for plunder. Well, they weren't looking for gold and jewelry. They were looking for things that would help them through the winter. They were looking for ponchos and tents and coats. So here's where weather and northern industrial technology mesh. Last point I want to make before I close. One of the books that I read when I was writing this book was by a historian named Mike Davis. Mike Davis just died a few months ago. Mike Davis is not a Civil War historian. You probably haven't heard of. He wrote a book about the rise of imperialism in the late 19th century throughout the world. Title is Late Victorian Holocausts. It's obviously not beach reading. Mike Davis pointed out that between 1887 and 1902, there were three major ENSO events, creating drought in parts of the world, monsoons and floods in other parts of the world. And that those storm systems, coupled with the way governments responded to those weather events, ended up costing the lives of 30 to 50 million people. When I was teaching World History Part 2 at Auburn University. You know, traditionally, when you talk about the rise of imperialism, you talk about things like machine guns or telegraphs or quinine. But the weather was a factor. It weakened people even as they were being conquered by European powers. Mike Davis calls this the secret history of the 19th century. Now, I don't mean to imply that looking at the Civil War through the lens of weather, or even through the wider lens of the environment, is the secret history of the Civil War. But I think it's a secret history of the Civil War. I think it's something we haven't understood as well as we need to. Walt Whitman famously said, the real war will never get in books. We've misinterpreted that statement for decades, but you know, there it is. If we really want to try to get to the real war and understand it as soldiers experienced it and civilians experienced it, and really understand why things happen the way they did sometimes, looking at it through that weather lens, through that environmental lens, will help us. We will see the war better. We will understand the war better. If we do what? If we take it back outside. I'm going to stop here. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Such a fascinating topic and a great presentation. While we're moving into the Q&A portion of things, I'm going to remind everyone, you should have seen this in emails from us, that the publisher of the book, LSU Press, has kindly offered a discount of 40% on purchases of the Howling Storm. And so I've just pasted into the chat the link you can follow if you don't have your copy yet to order it. And there's a discount code you can enter on the checkout page for that. So that is available to you in the chat. And with that said, let's go ahead and dive into the questions. Again, you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. One of the first questions we've got concerns the data, the weather data. How do you find out about what the weather was like on any given day in the Civil War?
Well, you have two kinds of data, essentially. You have hard data, which tends to come from surviving Smithsonian data, military data. Surgeons at permanent or sometimes impermanent installations were required to keep weather data, which they did. Newspapers sometimes, there are other sources. It becomes trickier once you're out in the field. Not only are soldiers not walking around with thermometers, but one of the things I learned writing this book was that there was a thermometer shortage in the Confederacy. People couldn't find them in Richmond. But there's hard data there. It exists in significant numbers in the Eastern Theater. It's spotty in the Western Theater. You sort of have to extrapolate sometimes. There's less in the Trans-Mississippi. That was the most frustrating thing for me, is it's just really hard to find. If you're a Trans-Mississippi buff and you know of a diary that has exact weather data, please identify it and publish it somewhere, because the field really, really needs that. So that's the sort of quantitative data that exists. You've also got a lot of qualitative data. Soldiers wrote a lot about the weather. They might not know that it was 65 rather than 68 degrees, but they wrote obsessively about the weather, to the degree that it sometimes threatened to swamp us as historians. I probably shouldn't tell this story, but I will. It's one of my favorites. When I was a master's student at Virginia Tech, I remember the late and great beloved Bud Robertson talking in class one day about how frustrating research could be. You finally find a diary from a unit you're trying to study, and you get there, and it's nothing but weather data. Now, for Bud, that was really frustrating when he was writing Stonewall Brigade. Those are the diaries I was looking for. So they exist. And what's really neat about the soldier accounts, and civilian accounts too, is that they generally line up pretty well. I wasn't sure if they would. I had a long conversation with a wonderful historian, Katie Shively, about, what if these were just old men sitting around remembering how awful things were when they were younger men? We all have a way, I guess, of doing that as we get older. If you have extra time at the end, I can talk about the coldest football game I ever played in. And the temperatures get lower every time I tell the story. But they didn't seem to do that. They actually line up pretty well. So in the end, this is the short answer I probably should have given in the first place. There's so much data out there that I had to find a way of limiting it.
Hmm.
I had to limit the number of sources. I had to try to identify what really, especially in terms of qualitative diaries and letters and so forth from soldiers and civilians. I had to find a way to limit that so that I wouldn't be swamped by all of it for the rest of my life. It's there. It's there, and we can find it and use it.
Thank you. And one of the things I really enjoyed about the book is how immersive it felt. Like, I think because you used so many of those soldiers' accounts to build up a picture of how they experienced the weather on a day-to-day basis, it really felt as though you understand, as a reader, you understand what the soldiers are going through. And for me, one of the most immersive elements that really kind of gave me a shiver when I read Soldier's accounts of it was mud, in fact, which I didn't necessarily expect going into the book. You see the title Weather in the Civil War, and it's like, okay, rain, storms, that kind of thing. But mud obviously became a really vital element in the way some of these campaigns played out. So at what point did you realize mud was going to be a central element here?
Oh, gee, I think pretty early in the game. This book didn't have a title for years. My wife called it the Mud Book. I actually thought about collecting mud samples from around the country just to have my own collection. I didn't do that, but I learned pretty early. This is something that I talk about when I do a longer version of this talk. There are essentially 12 different kinds of soil in the United States, and all of them react differently when water is applied. Most of the Confederacy uh, consists of one kind of soil. It's called ultisol. It's red clay. It's the stuff that I remember scraping off, shoes when I lived in Georgia and Alabama. And what's notable about ultisol is that there is a very deep place where it becomes more solid, but that deep place tends to be well below the height of a human or even a horse. Northern soldiers coming south were used to soil, mud is mud. It's awful. You get stuck in it, you get your wagon stuck in it, it's terrible. But at a certain point, you get down to a solid level and you can find your way out. They couldn't find their way out of this red clay soil. They called it bottomless. They seem to think it just went on into, the pits of the earth. And this dramatically affected campaigns because you're trying to move massive armies through this stuff sometimes. Through most of the Confederacy, there are examples. Well, there are exceptions too, on the Mississippi River, certainly in the mountains, certainly, in Montgomery County where you are right now, you got a different kind of soil. But by and large, you're dealing with this red clay. And they thought it was horrible. And they assumed that it was immoral. I'm thinking about the historian John Wesley Dean, who talks about how abolitionists saw this soil even before the war and thought that it was just, this is what slavery will do to your soil. They didn't really understand geology. So, mud is a constant, except when it's dry. And then it turns into a powdery dust that rises 10, 12, 15 feet in the air, and you're choking on this stuff. And that's the day-to-day life of moving troops through most of the Confederacy. Sometimes you have good weather, but sometimes there's dust. Sometimes there's mud. When did I first encounter this? I think like a lot of us, I read those stories about entire horses being buried in the mud. And I thought that was just hyperbole. I don't think that's hyperbole anymore. I know that's not hyperbole anymore. That actually happened in this bottomless red clay. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the environment, weather connecting to the earth, creating mud or dust, or sometimes a firm surface, had a incredibly important effect on troops and on people on the home front. Again, trying to grow crops in this stuff became harder.
Yeah. One of the, elements that I think people think of most quickly when they think about weather in the South is heat. That's true today and it
Yeah,
was true back then. How did Northerners, fighting in the Confederate States deal with the heat that they probably wouldn't have been used to?
not always well. Yeah, it seemed awfully hot to them. There's a section in the book where I talk about Vicksburg, the heat at Vicksburg, and you got all these Confederates saying, "Man, it was really warm today." And meanwhile, you got these Northerners who think they're going to die because it just seems so horribly hot to them. Um, so it was definitely a factor. Um, and of course, the opposite takes place too. When Confederate troops go north, they tend to think it's awfully darn cold.
Yeah. How about weapons? Did the weather affect the operation of weapons often?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The Battle of Mill Springs, early of 1862 in Kentucky. It had been raining. There was mist and rain throughout the day. And a lot of the Confederates, not just at Mill Springs, a lot of Confederates early in the war period, but certainly there, were still using whatever weapon they could find. A lot of them had flintlocks. Flintlocks will not fire in weather like this. So you have Confederates moving up against Federal position. They open fire, except the guns don't work. They end up using them as clubs. That's an extreme example. But yeah, I mean, it's going to have an effect on the operation of weapons, uh, trajectory of weapons, sight lines. Think about fog, rain, it's harder to see. In all of those ways, it affected um, rifles and larger guns.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Um, so we've got a couple of questions along similar lines about leaders, the generals on both sides,
Mhm.
and whether there were particular generals on one side or another who were attuned to the weather, who did a good job of handling the challenges of the weather, or, conversely, other examples of generals who were just clueless when it came to weather and really didn't get it.
Well, to me, that's one of the more fascinating things I discovered on the project. The generals who are really attuned to weather, what they believe is possible, are the generals that we tend to denigrate today. Who's responsible for shelter halves, aka pup tents, dog tents? George McClellan. George McClellan understood uh, how weather could limit the operations of an army. Don Carlos Buell, um, George Meade after Gettysburg, they all understand that it's going to be really hard to move in conditions like this. Um, their civilian bosses did not understand. They preferred generals who believed that they could conquer the weather, master the weather. One of the neat things I discovered, historian Mark Feige talks about this, and I borrowed it from my book, is that there is something he calls a Whiggish mentality in the 1860s. We can conquer the environment. We can tame that river. We can build that tunnel through the mountain. We can control weather itself, or we can ignore it if we're strong enough, if we have enough willpower. Um, both Davis and Lincoln wanted generals who would do that. They didn't want McClellan. They didn't want Joe Johnston saying, we better go into winter quarters and ride out this winter in Virginia. They wanted people like U.S. Grant who were willing to move despite the effect it would have on their troops. Grant moves through the overland campaign. He does. He gets to Petersburg. When he gets to Petersburg, his army is exhausted. Carol Reardon has discussed, I think, brilliantly how the overland campaign wore out that army and made a siege almost necessary. Of course, some really ugly failed frontal assaults didn't help either. the generals who understood the problems connected to weather tended to be the ones who lost favor in their capitals.
Yeah, makes sense. Um, how about extreme weather, tornadoes, hurricanes, any
Oh yeah,
examples of those?
something else I often talk about that I cut out. And also, I was looking at the Facebook the other day for this talk, and some people were talking about that. So I wanted to make sure that I could talk about that and cue it in. Weather extremes. Hottest battle award has to be Cedar Mountain, which again Bob Crick has written about pretty brilliantly. Uh, I mean, up in the upper 90s, maybe up to 100, men collapsing, fainting, according to some accounts, losing their minds in the heat due to heat stroke, heat prostration. Coldest days of the war, January 1st and January 2nd, 1864. January 1st, west of the Appalachians, January 2nd, east of the Appalachians. As late as the Great Depression, people here in the Midwest were talking about what they called the Cold New Year. Temperatures collapsed. New Year's Eve, 1863 in Cincinnati, was 44 degrees. The high the next day in Cincinnati was -7. People died. People froze to death in their homes, froze to death on trains. And this cold weather system affected everything from Canada down to Florida, where it got really unusually cold, at least for Floridians. In Florida, this is exactly the period when James Longstreet and his men are in East Tennessee trying to make shoes, trying to make moccasins out of animal skins, and they're hit with this terribly cold. Hurricanes. There were 3 that struck the American coast during the war itself. 3 is not many. That's actually added evidence that we're dealing with El Nino years. El Nino tends to push hurricanes away, but they're all really interesting. September 27th and 28th, 1861, an event called the equinoctial storm. I love to say that, the equinoctial storm, because it hit at the fall equinox. It created a tremendous amount of rain across Virginia into West Virginia. I mean, you had mudslides outside of Washington at some of those federal camps. It's worse over in West Virginia, where, let's not forget, there are still armies out there operating, trying to secure control of what's going to become that state. And you've got flooding, men drowning in this storm. November 1st through November 3rd, 1861, same year, the so-called Expedition Hurricane. That's the hurricane that struck the Port Royal expedition on its way out of Virginia down south, destroyed a lot of ships, delayed the federal movement there. And then my favorite, only because I just admire the scholarship so much, May 28th, 1863. One of the real giants in trying to understand 19th century weather is Professor Kerry Mock at the University of South Carolina. Kerry Mock and his research partner, Mike Chenoweth, were going through data, largely ship data, and discovered something that Civil War historians knew nothing about, which was a 3rd hurricane, which struck the Florida coast around Apalachicola on that date, May 28th, 63. It didn't have a name. They actually have named it Hurricane Amanda because it sank the USS Amanda, which was part of the blockade fleet out there. So 2 hurricanes in 1861, one of which was probably just a tropical storm. The Expedition Hurricane was probably not a hurricane anymore by the time it got to the Carolinas. One in 1863, and that's it for the war.
Right.
Tornadoes, I'm going to mention tornadoes too, because somebody asked me about tornadoes on Facebook. It's hard to say how many tornadoes existed, but I've identified at least 5 that affected the war itself. Tornadoes or tornado-like events. It's not always easy to tell. And I'll just list those really quickly because I think they're really interesting. May 2nd, 1862, there's a tornado that hits around Nathaniel Banks' column as he's going into the Shenandoah Valley to fight Stonewall Jackson. And it's really a localized storm because Confederates never write about it, but all these Federals do. So if we want to talk about how, the Federals weren't able to bag Stonewall Jackson in the valley, there's one reason. Um, April 4th, 1863, there is a confirmed tornado inside Vicksburg. May 4th, 1863, there is a tornado or something that looks a whole lot like tornado in the middle of the Battle of Chancellorsville. You've got wounded men behind the lines, behind federal lines who actually drown that day.
Hmm.
So that happens. May 1st, 1864 on the Rapidan River. It's right before the Overland Campaign. It actually holds off the Overland Campaign. And then the night of May 11th, May 12th, 1864, just outside of Richmond. That's the day of the Battle of Yellow Tavern. And of course, Jeb Stuart is killed at Yellow Tavern, and you've got men trying to get his body from the field back into Richmond in the middle of that torrential storm, which included tornadoes.
Hmm.
So, I mean, those are the extreme events that I think in particular affect.
Wow. Yeah, it's hard to even imagine, they're already going through all of the horrors and hardships of war, and then to have that kind of extreme weather event as well
I
is
have to imagine people in Vicksburg were just thinking, what next?
yeah,
What next? I mean, he took out city blocks.
yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned briefly there was a tendency among the Civil War generation sometimes to interpret weather through a kind of providential lens.
Yes.
I assume that became more common with these kinds of extreme events as well, probably.
That's a tough question. I'm not sure it did. I had a wonderful colleague at Auburn, Charles Israel, who studies American religion. One of the great ideas he came up with was for me to look at sermons. So I read a lot of sermons from Confederate ministers. I also looked for religious references in the letters of soldiers and civilians. And what I discovered was that happens sometimes. You may be thinking of the federal engineer down on the peninsula who's wondering why God isn't supporting the Union because there's all this rain, he's slowing us down. But people like that tended to be exceptions rather than the rule. I think it's really interesting, and I assume people have studied this. I certainly haven't. The 1860s are an interesting period in that people were not looking for providential reasons as much as they were starting to look for scientific causes of weather. Hence the Smithsonian Project. The entire project is based on the notion that God isn't causing rain in Montgomery County because people at Big Spring Baptist Church are praying for rain, but that rather weather is part of the larger continental systems. So there's a scientific explanation. And I will say that, and sure, men prayed for good weather all the time. Sometimes men prayed for bad weather. I was struck by how many soldiers on both sides were desperately hoping that they would have continued bad weather right before Chancellorsville because they didn't want to go out and fight again. Another month in camp would have been fine with them. There is that, but we're in this transitional period and people are starting to expect scientific reasons. They don't know what the scientific reasons are,
Yeah.
but they sense they exist.
That's really interesting, and it reminds me a bit of the patterns in medical history. And the Civil War is, I think, often seen as sort of a turning point, or an acceleration of the process towards more scientific
Yeah,
understandings of medicine that has a knock-on effect in the later 19th century as well. And it
yeah,
sounds like with weather, the same kind of things going on.
it absolutely did. Another question that I saw on Facebook. There's the old story that lots of artillery fire could cause rain, could bring about storms. There's no truth to it, by the way. But people believed it because it happened enough. It's like my dear grandmother, um, who was convinced throughout her life that it always turned gray and rained on Good Friday as the earth mourned the crucifixion. Well, there are a lot of sunny Good Fridays that I remember because I would always look, but it happened just enough that it would reinforce that notion and forget the others. People really did believe that too much gunfire caused storms. And so after the war, there are people who are desperately trying to prove this. There are actually people who get grants from the government. They're trying to get 200 howitzers. Give us enough surplus guns and we'll go prove this, or we'll launch balloons into the air and blow up things and make it rain. All those experiments failed, but as we all know, as late as the Great Depression, there were people going around the Dust Bowl, going around the Midwest and the West with surplus Civil War and World War I artillery pieces, promising to bring rain. It's an idea that exists, and there are people trying to prove it. There is scientific experimentation that goes on. I think more to the point, probably more logically, perhaps more grounded in reality. After the war, a few years after the war, the federal government will take the Smithsonian Project and will take the military weather recording practice and combine those into the U.S. Weather Bureau. So the Weather Bureau itself is sort of a creation of the Civil War because generals wanted a way to predict the weather in the next.
Right. Great. And speaking of the Smithsonian efforts, one viewer is asking whether the Smithsonian data is available online, or do you have to go there to get it?
It's not online, and it's not at the Smithsonian. It's at National Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland. It's on microfilm. Anybody can go in, you go through security, you go in, you ask for the reels you want. There are indexes that will take you to the one you're looking for. They are arranged by state and then locality. And you can go and you can look and see what's there, not just for the Civil War era, but really, back into the 1840s and all the way into the 1870s. That data exists, and it's free to look at if you're willing to go to College Park.
Excellent. Question about the farming background of the majority of Civil War soldiers on both sides. And the question is whether, the fact that they were farmers made them more accepting of bad weather, more used to its effects.
Yeah, I think so. I'm looking at the chat too, and I know the person who asked that question. Hi, Terry. They were mostly farmers, and I think that's really important in that A, they were used to being outside more, obviously. B, they were more used to dealing with the vagaries of weather. But beyond that, I think they understood the world in a way we don't.
Mm-hmm.
There's that whole notion of the past is another country. They understood that weather shaped what happened in their lives in a way that our generations, I think, have forgotten because we have air conditioning and central heating. We don't work outside. Most of us are not farmers. It was a lovely day here in central Illinois. It was take your tractor to work day. Or take your tractor to school day. There were pictures of all these kids who had brought their tractors to high school. But most of us don't live that way in the United States in 2024. And I think we almost have to interpret what soldiers were saying. They understood the environmental context of this war, I think, better than we do. And we have to find a way to look for that. And there are ways to do that, but we have to understand that they didn't exactly think the way we did. I mean, I grew up on a farm. Well, I didn't grow up on a farm. We had a farm growing up. Farm was 2 miles from the house. But I remember a lot of summers getting up hay. My grandfather let me plant a big field of corn once, and there was a drought in 1978. It died. Experiences like that affect the way you see life generally. It did for them.
So many farmers, I think, at this time would have consulted almanacs, for some inkling of what was going to happen. And you mentioned at the beginning there was no actual way to predict the weather, but to what degree did soldiers look to almanacs to try and figure out what might happen next?
They definitely talk about almanacs from time to time, especially federal soldiers. It was harder for Confederates to actually get them. So almanacs exist. You find the same sort of material often in newspapers. A lot of it is it's fun stuff, but it's strange. And again, it grows out of this notion that you can't predict the weather. I mentioned the cold New Year, the beginning of 1864. Apparently, the only people well, I won't say people. The only predictors of that cold New Year, according to newspapers in Minnesota and Maine, and I think later in almanacs recording all this, were muskrats. The muskrats were double walling their shelters, so it's going to be a bad winter. That's the sort of thing that people were reading and talking about. And I still remember people doing that when I was a kid in the 60s. This is happening, so it's going to be a bad winter. Here in central Illinois, people look at the middle black band of little woolly worms crawling around, and they predict the weather for that. I would say probably more newspapers than almanacs, but we certainly run across soldiers referencing, and they're
Yeah.
pretty good sources for what happens after.
We've got a couple of questions about the connection between weather and health. So one person is asking about how weather affected the experiences of wounded soldiers. Another person is asking about how far people or how much people understood connections between weather, whether it's rain and maybe stagnant water following on from that, the connection between that and disease.
Yeah, well, two good questions. In terms of the wounded, weather could make a horrific experience even worse. When you're dealing with being wounded, but it's also very cold, or it's also very hot. The battle I know best from previous book is Perryville, and one of the factors at Perryville that shaped both the battle and the aftermath was the lack of water. It's in the middle of that drought. Chaplain River basically wasn't running. The stagnant pools, men were desperate for water, and the water that they had was poisoned with all sorts of microbes. So at Perryville, you got the initial period of men dying. Then there's a period of a few days when most of the wounded seem to be recovering. And then they start dying.
Hmm.
It's the water. But the water is bad because of the drought. So there's story after story of the poor wounded, what they had to go through that night. The wounded at Chickamauga come to mind immediately because they're cold. Bob Crick proved years ago that no one was freezing to death on the field at Fredericksburg the night of the battle, but they were plenty cold enough, and they were going through some terrible moments. So yeah, it's definitely worse for in terms of disease, again, I'm probably bouncing off of people like Katie Shively more than I am my own research, but they really didn't understand. There's no germ theory until after the Civil War. People don't understand what causes disease. They might be making connections between swamps and people getting sick and dying, but they don't understand that it's based on microbes. So they're talking about, the air. They're talking about miasmas, bad things in the air floating around. They know something's going on, but they really don't know what it is. But they know it's worse in summer, and they know that disease is rampant in the South during the summer. And I don't think it's a major reason, but I think one of the reasons the Confederates thought they could win the war was that they were more used to those summer miasmas. They were more used to that brutal summer weather and the diseases that followed, the malaria, the yellow fever. And they really expected federal armies to come south and die. What happened is that when federal armies came south, a lot of them did die. But those who survived developed resistance, and also they had access to certain medicines that the Confederates were desperately trying to get through the blockade. So in a way that backfired. They didn't have the knowledge that we had, but they knew something was up, and germ theory is going to follow. And in some ways, interest in germ theory and what causes these diseases is a result of the war. We know that medical experimentation and interest in expanding how disease worked, in addition to how to save wounded men, we know that really takes off. And this is part of it.
Thank you. We've got time for just one or two more questions, and I'm just going to remind folks especially if you joined us late, that today Virginia Tech is celebrating Giving Day, which is an opportunity to donate and support various initiatives around the university. And the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies relies on donations from our generous supporters to be able to do what we do. So if you are able to help, even with just a few dollars, I'll paste in the link again into the chat, and we very much appreciate your support. We've got a question about the seasons and battle, and one viewer is making the point that there were not so many winter battles. Obviously, Fredericksburg is a good counterexample. There are others as well. But how did winter affect soldiers' ability to fight?
I'll say two things about that. First of all, political leaders on both sides wanted more winter battles. They wanted more winter campaigns. Lincoln was consistently pushing his generals to fight through the winter. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the armies go into winter camp. But with McClellan, for example, or really Meade later on, they're not allowed to officially go into winter quarters because the army is supposed to be out there moving and fighting. What that means is that dealing with winter, orders don't come from the top. The army stops, and every time the army stops for a few days, men start building winter shelters, hoping that that's where they're going to be all winter. And then they'll get thrown out and they'll go somewhere else and do it all over again. But this is happening on a regimental level. Sometimes it's happening on a brigade level. Very often it's happening on individual level. A few friends will get together and they'll not only build a shelter, but they'll build a shelter in a certain way as compared to their friends in the same company who are building their shelters in different ways. So you get these hodgepodges of winter shelter, and men will live in these cabins or hybrid tent log structures. They'll live there, sometimes all winter, sometimes for a few weeks, sometimes they'll get pushed out by the other army, and guys in other uniforms will end up living in your shelter. It's happening at a low level. No one is coming in and say, we're going to the winter camp, and I want the camps to look this way. Joe Johnston tried to do that in 1861, and basically Richmond told him no. So after that, I'm not sure that anyone tried.
Yeah, thank you. So this last question is just from me. First of all, as a Civil War historian, I'm really glad you wrote this book and did the incredible research that it took to write it. And I'm wondering whether other historians have done this or are doing this for other wars that you know of.
Well, certainly for other wars, I think historians of the First World War, for example, and in the Second World War too, were doing this before we were. As Civil War historians, we're coming to this pretty late. I'm really excited about some of the new books that I'm seeing within our field. David Sillicamp's new book, for example, looks at slavery in this environmental context, and I think it's a wonderful book. It's really very exciting. But certainly, this is happening, I think, with military historians in particular, with all sorts of wars in addition to the Civil War. I guess I'm just repeating myself now. We're late to the game.
But it sounds like First World War was maybe a pioneer.
Yeah, I think so too. There's a wonderful book edited by Harold Winters called Battling the Elements. And it includes a lot of early examples of what environmental / weather / military history would look like. And so, yeah, there's a lot in there about the Somme.
Yep.
And all of that mud.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure there are lots of common themes there between the Civil War and World War I in terms of weather, environment, the experience of battle.
Years ago at a conference, I met the great World War I historian Gary Sheffield. And he told me something I did not realize, and that's how much World War I historians study the American Civil War in a way that we do not study World War I.
Yeah.
So they're taking our lessons away, even if we're not seeing them ourselves.
Well, on that note, our time has come to an end. I want to encourage everyone to check out the other events we've got coming up. We have our big annual Civil War weekend, takes place here in Blacksburg, March 22nd through 24th. You can check out the schedule on our website. We've also got another online lecture and conversation coming up soon after that on April 15th. That one's going to be with Professor Kidada Williams. She's going to be talking to us about African Americans during the Reconstruction period. I also want to thank everyone for attending tonight. We really appreciate you. We appreciate the support of the donors who made this possible. We hope to see you all at future Virginia Center for Civil War Studies events as well. And most of all, thanks again to Dr. No for providing us with such a fascinating talk and also answering our questions so thoughtfully as well. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Paul. Thank you, Rachel. And a shout out to Professor Michael Meglish and his students at Blue Mountain. Thanks for joining me tonight.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.